The rain hammered down on the cobblestones outside Buckingham Palace that November morning. Inside the guardhouse, 23-year-old James Thornton stood perfectly still in his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap. His hands trembled slightly, but his face showed nothing. This was his first week as a Queen's Guard, and he had already learned the most important rule: never move, never react, no matter what happens. But today, something felt different. The crowds were thinner than usual. The gray sky hung low over London like a heavy blanket. James could hear the distant wail of sirens somewhere in the city. His commanding officer had briefed them that morning with unusual urgency. "Stay alert," he'd said, his voice tight. "Today is not an ordinary day." James didn't know what that meant. Nobody did. Through the corner of his eye, he saw a black car pull up to the palace gates. Then another, then 3 more. All unmarked, all moving with purpose. His heart began to beat faster, but his body remained frozen in position. A true guardsman never breaks stance. If you're enjoying this story, hit subscribe so you never miss these incredible true moments that changed lives forever. The palace doors opened. Staff members rushed out, their faces pale and strained. Something was happening inside those ancient walls, something the world didn't know yet. James felt the weight of his rifle against his shoulder. He'd trained for months to stand here, to protect this place, to be part of something bigger than himself. His mind drifted back 6 months earlier, to the small village in Yorkshire where he grew up. His grandfather had been a guardsman too. Back in the 1960s, the old man used to sit James on his knee and tell him stories. It's about standing watch during national crises. During moments when history held its breath, the guard doesn't just protect buildings, his grandfather would say, eyes distant with memory. We protect what those buildings represent. Hope, tradition, something people can believe in when everything else falls apart. James hadn't fully understood then, but now, standing in the drizzling rain with those black cars multiplying at the gates, he was beginning to. A woman in the crowd caught his attention. She was older, maybe 70, holding a bouquet of flowers wrapped in cellophane. Tears streamed down her weathered cheeks. She wasn't looking at James. She was looking past him, toward the palace, as if she could see through the stone walls to whatever was unfolding inside. More people began to arrive. Slowly at first, then in growing numbers. They didn't speak, they just came. Some carried flowers, some carried photographs. Many were crying, though James still didn't know why. His radio crackled softly in his ear. A voice, barely a whisper. "All units, maintain position. We go to Protocol 7.
Ow.
James's blood ran cold. That was the code they'd learned about in training, but never expected to use. The code reserved for only one type of situation. He wanted to look at his fellow guardsmen standing 20 feet away, wanted to exchange a glance that might confirm what he feared, but he couldn't move. A guardsman never moves. The crowd outside the gates had grown to hundreds now. The silence was deafening. And James Thornton, standing perfectly still in the rain, suddenly understood that he was about to witness something that would change Britain forever, inside the palace. Beyond those walls, he was sworn to protect. Something had gone terribly wrong. Asterisk, asterisk, 3 hours earlier. Before the rain started, James had been eating breakfast in the barracks. The television in the corner was showing the morning news. The anchor was talking about the Queen's upcoming visit to Scotland. Her busy schedule, the charity events planned for the month. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed fine, but his fellow guardsman, Marcus Chen, had looked worried. Marcus had been in service for 3 years, long enough to read the small signs others missed. "Something's off," he'd muttered, stirring his tea without drinking it. "The senior officers have been in meetings since 5 this morning." James had brushed it off. Officers always had meetings. Now, standing in the rain with Protocol 7 activated, he wished he'd paid more attention. The crowd continued to grow. It stretched down the mall now, thousands of people appearing as if summoned by some invisible signal. They stood in the rain without umbrellas, getting soaked, not caring. James could hear sobbing. He could hear prayers whispered in different languages. The flowers piled up against the palace railings, growing into mountains of color against the gray stone. An elderly man approached James's post. He wore a military uniform from decades past, medals pinned across his chest. His eyes were red. He stopped 3 feet away, came to attention, and saluted. Not to James, to the palace. To what it represented. James's throat tightened. He wanted to salute back, but he couldn't. A guardsman on duty never moves. The man held his salute for a full minute, tears running freely down his face. Then he lowered his hand, nodded once, and disappeared back into the crowd. Minutes felt like hours. James's legs ached from standing so still. The rain soaked through his uniform. But the training held. His grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. When the nation needs strength, they look to us. We give them something solid, something that doesn't break. A phone rang somewhere in the crowd. Then another. Then hundreds. People pulled out their devices, looked at the screens, and the crying intensified. Whatever news was breaking, it was spreading like wildfire now. James's radio crackled again. All guardsmen maintain dignity and composure. The world is watching. The world is watching. Those 4 words made it real. A little girl, maybe 7 years old, slipped through the crowd barriers. She carried a single rose. Security moved to stop her, but an officer waved them back. The girl walked slowly toward James, her small shoes splashing in puddles. She looked up at him with enormous brown eyes, then gently laid the rose at his feet. "Thank you for protecting her," the girl whispered. "Protecting her." Past tense. James's heart shattered, but his face remained stone. The girl returned to her mother, who scooped her up and held her tight, both of them crying into each other's shoulders. All around the palace, the same scene repeated. Strangers embracing, people who had never met sharing grief like family. Inside the guardhouse window, James could see his commanding officer. The man's shoulders were shaking. He was weeping, something James had never seen before. Officers didn't cry. Officers were iron. But today, even iron was breaking. The palace flag caught James's attention. It hung still in the rain, barely moving. He watched it, waiting. He knew what would happen next, even though he prayed he was wrong. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the flag began to descend. The crowd saw it. A collective gasp rippled through thousands of throats. People fell to their knees on the wet pavement. The flag lowered inch by inch. The protocol followed with perfect precision, till it reached half-dash mast, and there it stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the rain seemed too quiet. James stood frozen, his eyes burning with tears he couldn't let fall. The flag at half-mast could mean only one thing. Britain had lost someone who could never be replaced. His radio crackled one final time. The voice was thick with emotion. "Guardsmen, the nation thanks you for your service on this darkest of days. Remain strong." She would want us to remain strong. Queen Elizabeth II was gone. Asterisk, asterisk. The hours that followed blurred together like a dream James couldn't wake from. He stood his post as the crowd swelled to tens of thousands. People came from every corner of London, then from across Britain, then from around the world. They came to say goodbye to a woman who had reigned for 70 years, who had been the only constant in a changing world. James had been born in the year 2000. The Queen had already been on the throne for 48 years by then. She was the only monarch Britain had known for generations, and now she was gone. When his shift finally ended 6 hours later, James walked back to the guardhouse on legs that barely held him. Inside, guardsmen who never showed emotion were openly weeping. Marcus sat on a bench, his head in his hands. The television showed footage of the announcement, the newsreaders in black, their voices breaking as they shared the news with the world. James collapsed onto a chair. He was 23 years old, trained to face any threat, prepared to defend the crown with his life. But nobody had prepared him for this. "She died at Balmoral," Marcus said quietly, not looking up. "Peacefully, with her family around her." Asterisk Balmoral. Scotland. Her favorite place, the one location where she could truly be herself instead of a symbol. There was something right about that, James thought. Something gentle, but it didn't make the pain any less. His phone buzzed. Messages from his mother, his sister, his grandfather. The old man's text was simple. "You're doing her proud, lad." "Stand tall?" James tried to reply, but his hands were shaking too hard. He set the phone down and closed his eyes. Behind his eyelids, he saw the crowd, the flowers, the little girl with the rose. He saw the flag descending. He saw the woman in black who had stood in the rain for hours, holding a photograph of a young Queen Elizabeth from the 1950s, her face radiant with youth and hope. "They're asking for volunteers," a voice said. James opened his eyes. His captain stood in the doorway, still in full dress uniform, his face drawn and exhausted. "For the vigil. When she comes home to London, when she lies in state, we need guardsmen to stand watch. 24 hours a day. It will be the longest, hardest duty you'll ever perform." Nobody hesitated. Every hand in the room went up. The captain nodded, his eyes glistening. I expected nothing less. Over the next days, the world transformed. Britain mourned as one. The queue to see the Queen lying in state stretched for miles. People waiting 10, 12, 15 hours just for a few seconds in her presence. Celebrities stood in line next to factory workers. Millionaires waited beside students. Grief made everyone equal. And through it all, the guardsmen stood watch. They changed every 20 minutes, their movements precise and rehearsed, a dance of dignity performed 1,000 times. James took his turn in Westminster Hall, standing at the corners of the catafalque, his head bowed, his rifle held in tribute. The silence in that ancient hall was sacred. Thousands filed past, but barely a sound could be heard except footsteps and quiet sobbing. James kept his eyes down, but he could feel them. People from every nation, every background, every belief, all united in saying goodbye. An old veteran stopped in front of the coffin. He was bent with age, leaning on a cane, his service medals from World War II catching the light. He came to attention as best he could, his body remembering what his joints had forgotten. He stood there for a long moment, then whispered something James couldn't hear. But he didn't need to hear it. He understood. During a break, James stood outside Westminster Hall and watched the queue. It wound through London like a river of humanity. A woman interviewed by television reporters spoke through tears. She gave us 70 years. The least we can do is give her a few hours of our time. 70 years. James tried to comprehend it. The Queen had seen 15 prime ministers. She had lived through wars, scandals, celebrations, and tragedies. She had watched the empire become a commonwealth, watched Britain change in ways no one could have predicted. And through it all, she had remained constant. A fixed point in a spinning world, his grandfather called that evening. The old man's voice was rough with emotion. "I stood guard for her coronation in 1953, he said. "I was younger than you are now. I thought she'd reign forever." "So did everyone," James replied. "No," his grandfather corrected gently. "We knew this day would come. We just couldn't imagine it." That night, James couldn't sleep. He kept seeing the faces in the queue, the grief that poured from millions of hearts. This wasn't just about losing a queen. It was about losing a grandmother, a symbol, a connection to something greater than themselves. Tomorrow would bring the funeral. The world would watch, and James would stand guard one final time. Asterisk, the morning of the funeral arrived cold and clear. London woke under a pale September sky, the city transformed into something James had never seen before. Every street, every building, every corner draped in black and purple. Millions lined the route, standing shoulder to shoulder in perfect silence. James stood in formation, with his unit outside Westminster Abbey. They would be part of the procession, walking behind the gun carriage that carried the Queen's coffin. It was an honor beyond measure. It was also terrifying. "Remember your training," Marcus whispered beside him. "One step at a time. Don't think about the cameras. Don't think about the world watching. Just put one foot in front of the other." Wow. But how could James not think about the cameras? How could he ignore the fact that billions of people across the planet were watching this moment? The funeral of Queen Elizabeth II was the most viewed event in human history. Every screen on Earth showed the same images. The same grief. The gun carriage emerged from Westminster Hall, pulled by Royal Navy sailors in their dress whites. The coffin sat atop it, draped in the royal standard, the imperial state crown resting on top. That crown had sat on her head for 70 years. Now it made its final journey. Behind the coffin walked King Charles III, his face carved from stone, fighting to maintain composure. Beside him, his sons. Behind them, members of the royal family, world leaders, representatives from every nation. And flanking them all, the guardsmen in their scarlet and gold. The procession began to move. James fell into step, his boots striking the pavement in perfect rhythm with hundreds of others. The only sound was marching feet and the slow toll of Big Ben, each chime marking another step toward goodbye. The crowds watched in absolute silence. James had never experienced anything like it. Millions of people and not a single voice. Faces streamed with tears, but nobody spoke. The respect was overwhelming as they passed Buckingham Palace. James saw the balcony where the Queen had stood countless times, waving to her people. It was empty now. It would never be the same again. An elderly woman in the crowd caught his eye. She held a black and white photograph faded with age. It showed a young soldier and a young queen, both impossibly young, both smiling at a garden party decades ago. The woman pressed the photograph to her heart and wept. How many memories were walking with them today? How many moments, both public and private, were being remembered? The Queen had touched millions of lives, often without knowing it. A kind word here, a letter there, a moment of recognition that changed someone's entire world. They reached Westminster Abbey. The ancient doors stood open, the interior ablaze with candlelight. James and his unit took their positions outside as the coffin was carried in. Through the open doors, he could hear the hymns beginning, the voices of the choir rising like prayers. He thought about the little girl who had laid the rose at his feet. He thought about the veteran who had whispered his goodbye. He thought about his grandfather watching this on television in Yorkshire. Remembering his own service all those years ago, the service lasted over an hour. James stood motionless, listening to prayers spoken in that same abbey where the Queen had been crowned in 1953, where she had married Prince Philip, where history had happened again and again. When the service ended, the coffin emerged once more. The procession reformed, but now they traveled toward Windsor, toward the final resting place. James and his unit were relieved by others, but their duty wasn't over. They would stand honor guard at Windsor Castle at the committal service. At the very end, the drive to Windsor passed in a blur. The crowds never thinned. If anything, they grew larger. Every bridge, every overpass, every street corner held people saying goodbye. Some threw flowers onto the road. Others saluted. Many simply wept. At Windsor Castle, James took his position for the final time. The committal service was smaller, more intimate, family only. This wasn't for the world. This was personal. Through the chapel windows, James could see the coffin being lowered. He could see King Charles place the Queen's company camp color on the coffin. He could see the crown, the scepter, and the orb being removed and placed on the altar. The symbols of monarchy separated from the woman at last. The Lord Chamberlain broke his wand of office, signifying the end of the Queen's reign. The sound of it snapping echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. And then, as the coffin descended into the royal vault, a lone piper played a lament. The sound drifted across Windsor, across the Thames, across all of Britain. It was the sound of an era ending. James felt tears finally slip down his cheeks. A guardsman wasn't supposed to cry. But today, the rules didn't matter. Today, even guardsmen were allowed to grieve. The piper's final note faded into silence. Queen Elizabeth II had gone home. Asterisk, asterisk, the days after the funeral felt strange and hollow. London slowly returned to normal, though nothing felt normal anymore. The flowers remained piled against palace railings for weeks, slowly withering but constantly replenished. People couldn't stop bringing them. Couldn't stop saying goodbye. James returned to regular duties, but everything had changed. When tourists posed for photos with the guardsmen now, they did it with different faces. Less playful, more respectful. They understood now what James and his fellow guardsmen represented. Not just tradition or ceremony, but continuity. A promise that some things endure. One afternoon, a month after the funeral, James stood post at Buckingham Palace when an elderly couple approached. They were American, he could tell from their accents. The woman looked at him with kind eyes, then spoke softly. "Were you here?" That day, James couldn't respond. A guardsman on duty doesn't speak, but the woman understood. She saw the answer in his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for standing strong when the rest of us were breaking." They walked away, and James felt something shift in his chest. He'd spent weeks questioning whether what he did mattered. Standing still, not moving, not speaking. It seemed so small compared to the enormity of what had happened, but maybe that was the point. Maybe in a world that was falling apart, someone needed to stand still. Someone needed to be steady. His grandfather visited him in London that weekend. The old man had never made the trip before, but he said he needed to see where James stood guard. They walked together along the mall, past the memorial outside the palace. "I stood here when she was crowned," his grandfather said, his voice distant with memory. "June 2nd, 1953. I was 19 years old. The crowds were bigger than anything I'd ever seen. Everyone thought she was too young, too inexperienced. She was only 27. They stopped, looking at the palace. But she proved them all wrong," his grandfather continued. "She became the greatest monarch we've ever known. You know why?" James shook his head. "Because she understood something most people don't. Leadership isn't about power. It's about service. Every single day, she woke up and asked herself, what can I do for my country? Not, what can my country do for me? That's why people loved her. That's why millions stood in the rain to say goodbye." James thought about that. About service. About duty. About standing in the rain when everything felt hopeless and doing it anyway because someone had to. "The new king," his grandfather said. "King Charles. He has enormous shoes to fill. But he understands service too. He's been preparing for this his entire life." Over the following months, James watched Britain adjust to its new reality. King Charles appeared on coins and stamps. Royal protocol shifted slightly, but the core remained the same. The monarchy endured because it represented something beyond any single person. James received a letter one day, forwarded through official channels. It was from the little girl who had laid the rose at his feet. Her name was Sophie, and her mother had helped her write. "Dear Guardsman," it read in careful child's handwriting. "Thank you for being brave when I was scared. My mom says the Queen would be proud of you. I think so too. When I grow up, I want to be strong like you." James read that letter 3 times, then carefully folded it and put it in his wallet. He carried it with him every day after that. During a changing of the guard ceremony, something unexpected happened. The crowd, instead of just watching and taking photos, began to applaud. Not the usual polite clapping for tourists, but genuine, heartfelt applause. A standing ovation for guardsmen who were just doing their job. James kept his face neutral, his movements precise. But inside he understood. The applause wasn't for him personally. It was for what he represented: dedication, duty, the promise that some things don't change even when everything else does. That night, he called his grandfather. "I think I finally understand," James said. "What you tried to tell me about being a guardsman?" "What's that, lad?" "We're not just protecting buildings or people. We're protecting an idea. The idea that there's still honor in service, that promises still mean something, that some things are worth standing for, even when your legs ache and the rain soaks through your uniform." His grandfather was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was thick with pride. "You've learned in months what took me years to understand. Your queen would have been proud." "Your queen?" The phrase caught James off guard. She had been his queen. For his entire life, even if most of it she had just been a distant figure on television and coins. But in her death, she had become real to him in a way she never had in life. He thought about all the people who had stood in that queue, who had waited hours just for a few seconds near her coffin. What had they found there? What had James found, standing guard? Peace, maybe. Closure. A chance to say thank you to someone who had given everything. Asterisk a year later. James stood in almost the exact same spot where he had stood on that rainy September morning. But today was different. Today was the coronation of King Charles III. The crowds were back, but their mood had shifted. There was still sadness, still the ghost of grief that would probably never fully leave. But there was also hope, anticipation, the sense that Britain was turning a page, not closing a book. James wore the same scarlet tunic, the same bearskin cap, but he wore them differently now. With understanding, with purpose that went deeper than duty, the Golden State coach passed. Carrying the new king to Westminster Abbey, Charles looked out at his people, and they looked back with eyes that remembered his mother, but were willing to give him a chance, to trust that he would serve them as she had served. Inside the Abbey, the ceremony unfolded with the same traditions that had been followed for 1,000 years. The anointing, the crowning, the moment when Charles became not just a king, but the king. The same crown that had rested on his mother's coffin now sat on his head. Heavy with history and responsibility, James couldn't see inside, but he could hear the trumpets, the choir. The moment when the congregation shouted, "God save the King," for the first time in 70 years. The sound sent chills down his spine. When the ceremony ended and the king emerged, he looked transformed, not by the crown or the robes, but by the weight of what he had accepted. The burden of service his mother had carried for so long was now his. The procession back to Buckingham Palace followed the same route as the funeral had, but in reverse. James marched alongside, seeing different faces in the crowd this time. Less tears, more smiles. Children waving flags. The nation choosing to believe again. At the palace, the new king appeared on the balcony with his family. The crowd roared its approval. Jets flew overhead in formation, trailing red, white, and blue smoke across the London sky. It was a celebration, but it was also a promise. The monarchy would continue. Britain would continue. That evening, after his duties ended, James returned to the barracks to find an envelope waiting for him. Inside was an official commendation signed by the king himself, thanking the guardsmen who had served during the period of mourning. But there was also a handwritten note. To those who stood firm when the ground beneath us shook, who remained steady when our hearts were breaking, who showed the world what true service looks like, my mother would have been immensely proud. I am honored to serve alongside you. It was signed simply. Charles or James read those words over and over. The king had written this himself, had thought about the guardsmen, about their service, about what they represented. Just as his mother would have done, Marcus found him sitting on his bunk, the note in his hands. "You all right, mate?" "Yeah," James said, and meant it. "I think I am. It's been quite a year." "It's quite a year," James agreed. They sat in comfortable silence, two guardsmen who had lived through history together, who had stood watch as one era ended and another began, who had learned that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply stand firm when everything around you is falling apart. James's phone buzzed. Another message from his grandfather watching the news. "The new king looks good." But more importantly, the guardsman looked perfect. "Well done, lad." James smiled. He thought about Sophie, the little girl with the rose, who wanted to grow up to be strong. He thought about the veteran who had saluted the palace with tears in his eyes. He thought about the millions who had queued for hours just to say goodbye to a woman who had given them 70 years of steady, quiet service. And he thought about his own service, just beginning, stretching ahead into an unknown future. Would he stand guard for King Charles for as long as his grandfather had stood for Queen Elizabeth? Would he see another coronation, another passing, another transformation? Nobody knew. The future was always uncertain, but that was okay. Because some things didn't change. Duty didn't change. Honor didn't change. The promise to stand firm, to serve with dignity, to represent something bigger than yourself that didn't change. James put on his dress uniform one more time and looked at himself in the mirror. He saw a guardsman, but he also saw something else. He saw someone who understood, finally, what his grandfather had been trying to tell him all along. The scarlet tunic didn't make him special. The bearskin cap didn't make him important. What mattered was the choice he made every day to put on that uniform and stand in the rain, in the heat, in the glare of a watching world, and be steady. To be the person others could look at and think, some things still matter. Some promises are still kept. Some people still understand what it means to serve. Outside, Big Ben chimed the hour. London settled into night, its streets finally quiet after a day of celebration. Tomorrow would bring new duties, new challenges, new moments when the world needed someone to stand firm. And James Thornton, guardsman in service to the crown, would be there. Standing tall, standing proud, standing ready, because that's what guardsmen do. They stand watch, not just over palaces and royals, but over the very idea that some things are worth protecting. That service matters. That duty, honor, and loyalty aren't old-fashioned words, but timeless truths. The Queen had shown Britain what a lifetime of service looked like. Now, it was their turn to carry that example forward, one day at a time, one shift at a time, one steady heartbeat at a time. The Guard would stand. Britain would endure. And somewhere, James liked to think, Queen Elizabeth II was watching with approval. Knowing that the young guardsmen she had inspired were carrying on her legacy of unwavering dedication to something greater than themselves, the rain began to fall again. Gentle this time, washing the streets of London clean. And James smiled, knowing that tomorrow he would stand in that rain, protecting not just a building or a person, but a promise that would outlast them all.